In this session, we're going to explain the concept of permissions. Now, the concept of permissions is a little bit tricky for someone who is new to the Linux operating system, but hopefully once we break it down piece by piece in this session, it's going to be really easy to understand. So, first thing, the Linux operating system is actually a multi-user system, which means more than one person can be using the computer at the same time. So in order to facilitate this, the following is used to not allow the actions of one user to crash the computer or even allow one user to interfere with the files of another user. So we have five main commands. We have the change mod command or chmod command, which modifies the file access rights. We have the su command, which helps you switch to the super user for a period of time. We have the sudo command, which is a very famous command in Linux, and this helps you to run a command as super user. You have the change ownership, which helps you to change the file ownership. And finally, you have the change group, which lets you change the file group. So rights can actually be assigned to either read a file, write a file, or execute a file. So to see the permissions of a certain file, you could use, for example, the command ls-lh. In our example here, we are running ls-lh on a file called new file. This is an empty file just created for the purposes of this explanation. And right now we're going to see what we can determine from this permissions part. All this gibberish is now gonna make sense. So we can determine the following. We can determine that the file that's called here new file is owned by the user Ibrahim. So that's the first thing we notice. The second thing we notice is that the user Ibrahim has the right to read and write to this file. And this actually shows right over here, read and write. The second thing is that the file is owned by the group Ibrahim, which shows right here. The third thing we can conclude is that members of the group Ibrahim can also read and write this file, which is shown right here by this R and W. Everybody else can only read this file, which is shown by this R right here. And the dash at the beginning, well, this actually shows that this is a file and not a directory, because if it were a directory, it's gonna show as a D. Let's take a look at another example. Here we have the /bin/bash file, and I'm running again an ls-lh on that file. And here we have that this file is actually owned by the user root. The super user, who is root, has the right to read, write, and execute this file, which is shown here by the rwx. The file is owned by the group root. Members of the group root can also read and execute the file, so they cannot write to this file. And everybody else can also read and execute this file. Here we're going to dissect just the different parts of the permission like we saw in the two examples. So the first thing, the dash, this shows the file type. So if it's a dash, that means this is a file. If it's a directory, for example, it's going to show up as a D. If it is a link, as a symbolic link, it's going to show up as an L. The next part is the owner permission, and it's going to be rwx read, write, execute. Following that is the group rw, and here we have a dash, so this means we have read and write only for the group, and all others can only read. So to change the permissions, we have certain letters that we can use, and this is actually the easy version. We have two other methods of changing the permissions of a file, but I'm not really a big fan of those, so we're not going to be covering them here because, as far as I'm concerned, this easy version, as I like to call it, is more than enough. So we're going to agree that U stands for user, G stands for group, O stands for others, and A stands for all. And the command to use, as we said, is chmod, and we could put a U, a G, an O, an A for user, group, others, or all. We have a plus minus to give a permission or take away a permission, and then we're going to use R, W, or X for read, write, execute. So just as a very simple example, if I want, for example, to give the user the right to execute a file, I'm going to write chmod user. So I'm going to put U because I want to change the permissions for the user. I'm going to put a plus, so I'm going to give him the permission to execute. And just going to put the name of the file. So it's really that simple. Just going to write, if you want to change for the user, the group, others, or all. Plus or minus depends on whether you want to give a permission or take away a permission, and then what permission are we talking about? Is it read, write, or execute? Now, you can also change the owner of a file by using chown or change ownership, like we covered in the first slide. And you can use the change group to change the group itself. So, for example, right here, I'm doing an ls-lh on file1.txt. You can see it is owned by Ibrahim and the group as well, Ibrahim. If I do a change ownership and write root, so I'm changing the owner to root for file1.txt. If I run an ls-lh another time, I'm going to see the user is now changed to root. Same goes for the command change group, exactly the same format, change group, the group you want to change it to, and then the file name, and you're going to see that now we have successfully as well changed the root as a group. So just keep in mind, to change the owner of a file, you must be the super user and you must be root, and as you can see, we are logged in this session as root. So how to become the super user or becoming the super user for a while? The command to use is very simple. You're just going to write su. It's going to prompt you for your password, for the root password, and just by writing that password and hitting enter, you're going to see that you successfully changed from the user Ibrahim to the super user root. If you want to exit that session, you're just going to simply type exit, and it's going to bring you back to your username. The command sudo, well, the command sudo lets you run a command that you would normally need a super user to run without the need to switch to the super user. So it gives you the permission to run a command as super user. You can remember it as super user does or super user do. So right here, for example, I am in the root directory and I'm trying to make a new directory called new_dir, and it tells me cannot create the directory, permission denied. So I do not have permission as the user Ibrahim to create a new directory in the slash partition, in the root partition. So if I write exactly the same command but saying sudo before it, so sudo make dir new_dir, it's gonna let me put in my password. So it says sudo password for Ibrahim. If I type in the sudo password, it's gonna normally run that command as a super user. And you can see it successfully created the directory here. Total 0, of course, because this is an empty directory, but nevertheless, we did create the directory successfully.